There are stories born from memories kept over time, where small, everyday gestures become testimonies of life. This is one of those stories, not just a narrative, but a shared piece of soul. Between the simplicity of days and the depth of what remains unseen, there are memories that linger, echoes of a past that somehow never fully drifts away. Good evening, Dom. I decided to share this account because sometimes the weight of memories must be divided. Some stories do not belong solely to those who live them, but to everyone who finds in them a reflection of their own experiences. The story I am about to tell is not mine, but my grandmother's. To make it easier to understand, imagine that from now on, I am her telling her own story. My name is Regina. I am 70 years old, and I have never left this village where I was born, grew up, and built my life. It was here that I met my husband, saw my 3 children be born, and also watched them leave, one by one, following paths different from mine. My life has always been simple, like that of so many others in this corner of Mexico. But within that simplicity, I found a certain kind of beauty. When I was still young, I learned to value the small details, those that often go unnoticed, but form the backbone of family routines. My mother, when I was still a child, taught me how to make fruit preserves. First, we would watch for the right season to pick papayas, mangoes, or plums. Then came the most enchanting part, peeling, slicing, cooking them with sugar, and carefully filling the plastic bags. I would tie each one attentively, making sure the syrup did not leak, avoiding complaints from the neighbors. Saturdays were the busiest days. I would walk down the stone streets carrying my basket. Children would run up to me asking for the sweetest treats, while older ladies bought them to please their grandchildren or sweeten their own days a little. Sometimes I took my preserves to more distant communities. I would return exhausted, but with my heart full, for honest work fills the soul in a way that money never can. However, my mother taught me more than cooking. Hand in hand with her, from an early age, I learned the value of faith. On Sundays, she took me to church, where I discovered the prayers echoing against the high walls of that place. At first, I simply watched her as she brought her hands together and closed her eyes with solemnity. Like that, almost without noticing, I ended up memorizing the prayers. Over time, the habit of accompanying her turned into a commitment. The villagers began asking me to lead prayers at wakes, vigils, and anniversary masses for the deceased. At first, it felt strange because I did not see myself as different from anyone else. But according to them, there was something about my voice, a clarity that brought comfort. I remember well the first times I led the rosary at a wake. My hands trembled with nervousness. On one occasion, I was called to a modest home where there was barely room for the relatives' chairs. The glow of candles lit up tired faces, while the scent of warm wax and flowers filled the air. Outside, the night was still, almost as if it were paying its respects. It was on that night that I realized my task went beyond reciting words. It was as though I served as a connection between those people and something greater, something that could give them back their strength. Over time, I grew accustomed to this role, and my heart learned to sense what each situation needed. Some families asked for more words. Others needed only silence. There were occasions when I was called upon to lead the rosary in the cemetery, where crosses and headstones seemed endless. It did not matter if the night was cold or if the wind blew out the candles. I always carried with me the prayer book my mother had given me. Its pages, already worn by time, held not only words, but precious memories of everything I had learned from her. Life was not always generous to me. Losing my husband felt like losing a part of myself as well. But I never allowed sadness to keep me from doing what needed to be done. I continued making my preserves, leading the rosaries, and taking care of the house over the years. As I grew used to the task of praying for the departed, I realized it was not as simple as bringing my hands together and reciting words. There were days when I came home feeling heavy, as if I were carrying something invisible. My mother used to say that it was natural. It's the weight of emotions, or even the spirit of the person who passed away. She said it so calmly that sometimes it frustrated me. I did not understand how she could be so serene in the face of something so strange, but over time I realized it was not something to be understood, just accepted. In the beginning, what affected me most was the exhaustion. I would come home after a rosary feeling a different kind of fatigue. It was not just physical. It was as if something inside me had been worn down. Some nights, sleep simply would not come. And when I finally slept, my dreams were confused, full of images that seemed to make no sense. At those times, my mother's words echoed in my mind. "Don't worry, my daughter. God is with you, and He protects you." Still, it was hard to ignore the fear that sometimes took hold of me. Some of the deceased seemed more resistant, as if they refused to find peace. Some were silent, just shadows in my dreams, wandering without causing any disturbance. Others, however, made sure to reveal themselves in ways that could not be ignored. More than once, I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that I was not alone. The air suddenly turned cold, and my heart pounded so strongly it filled the silence. Sometimes I heard soft footsteps, almost imperceptible, as if someone were walking barefoot on the packed earth. Other times it was the sound of something moving in the kitchen. On one occasion, I even found a chair overturned for no apparent reason. My mother always said that these spirits had been good people in life, but they carried guilt or suffering they could not leave behind. Those were the souls that showed up in my dreams with expressions of sadness or despair, as if asking for something they could not put into words. But not all of them were like that. There were other spirits, the kind I avoided even talking about. These were the souls of those who had done harm in life, leaving behind a heavy energy that did not disappear. Often, before beginning a rosary, I could already feel their presence. The atmosphere grew dense, and a chill ran through my body. They were the ones that left me the most debilitated. After praying for them, I would become ill with fever, pain, or nausea, as though their energy clung to me. My mother, who seemed to know everything, always told me to trust that faith was stronger than any evil. But there were nights when my faith was tested. I dreamed many times of unfamiliar faces, eyes carrying something I could not name. When I awoke, there was a weight on my chest, as if someone were sitting there. I remember one night, while setting the dinner table, I heard a crash coming from the back room. Upon checking, I found the framed photo of my mother on the floor, with no explanation for how it had fallen. Over time, I learned to deal with these experiences. I never stopped praying, because besides feeling it was my duty, I believed that, in some way, my faith was a shield against any evil. One of the most difficult experiences I faced happened when I was called to lead the rosary for a man who lived near the town square. His name was Eduardo, and his reputation was not good. They said he had been a cruel man, unscrupulous, someone who did not hesitate to harm others when there was a dispute. According to the stories, an argument over land ended in tragedy, with many lives lost, and everyone knew he had been responsible. Even so, his family insisted on giving him a dignified farewell, as if they wanted to cover up with flowers and prayers the marks that time does not erase. I accepted the invitation to lead the rosary, but something inside me hesitated. From the moment I received the request, I carried an unexplainable heaviness in my chest. On the day, the house was packed. Everyone there seemed to know one another, but the atmosphere was strange, as if no one truly wished to be present. Outside, the sun shone intensely, but inside the house, the air was cold and uncomfortable. I tried to focus on the prayers, but my mind was scattered as though something was trying to stop me. I concluded the rosary with great effort, maintaining my usual respect and devotion, but by the end, I felt an exhaustion unlike anything I had experienced before. The family thanked me for coming, but I knew I could not stay any longer. As soon as I got home, something seemed to break inside me. I ran to the yard and vomited, feeling a malaise with no explanation. My husband, who was still alive then, hurried to help me regain my breath. Without questioning, he offered me water and took me to our bedroom. That night, I could not eat. The weakness I felt was unlike anything I had ever known. It felt rooted in my soul. The following morning, I was awakened by a strange sensation. The bed beneath me seemed to shake, as if someone were forcefully rocking it. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, something common in the region. But I soon noticed that the movement was irregular, unsettling, as if it did not come from the earth, but from something much closer. I screamed and sat up abruptly, disoriented. I looked around, but everything was exactly in place. The chairs, the table, the furniture, nothing seemed disturbed. Before I could understand what was happening, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. My son, who was 12 at the time, came out of his room with eyes wide with fear, asking what was going on. I tried to reassure him, saying that I had felt a tremor, but his answer left me perplexed. He had been awake for a while and felt absolutely nothing, neither in his room nor anywhere else in the house. A chill ran up my spine. I returned to my bedroom, sat on the bed, my heart pounding, and that strange unease I had felt at Eduardo's house seemed to have returned. It was as if something had clung to me, refusing to let go. That morning, as soon as the sun rose, I said a special prayer for protection for me and my family. It was not the first time I sought God's help, but in that moment, I did it with a force that came from the deepest place in my heart. I lit a white candle and clasped my hands, repeating the words my mother had taught me to ward off evil. My husband, ever the rational one, said it was all just exhaustion, that maybe my mind was imagining things because I was so tired. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. The next day, I tried to return to my routine, as if nothing had happened. I got up early, prepared lunch for the children, and started tidying the house. Although I could not stop thinking about the bed shaking and the sensation of being followed, I tried my best to ignore it. I did not want to worry the little ones or let my imagination run wild. While sweeping the living room, I noticed the broom was worn out and needed replacing. So, I asked my youngest daughter, only 7, to get the new broom from the little storage room in the yard. She went promptly, as she always did, obedient and calm. I continued cleaning, expecting her to return in a matter of seconds. But, to my surprise, she came back almost immediately, running, eyes wide, hands shaking. Her voice was thin, filled with fear. There was a man in the storage room, a tall man with a mustache. At first, I thought she must have mistaken a shadow for something else. The little storage room was poorly lit. Only a few rays of sunlight slipped through the wooden gaps, creating shapes that could fool a child. I set the broom aside and walked to the yard, trying to calm her. I asked her to stay in the kitchen doorway while I checked. Deep down, I was certain I would find nothing, that it was just a childish fright. I opened the storage room door decisively, determined to settle the matter at once. And there he was, standing at the back of the room. The light from the doorway lit his face, and it was impossible not to recognize him. Eduardo, the man for whom I had prayed the rosary the day before. His thick mustache, his stern expression, those piercing, fixed eyes, everything was there. He stood still, like a wax statue, but his presence carried something that chilled me to the core. It was not just the fact of seeing him there, it was the way his eyes seemed to pierce my soul. The air in the room was dense, almost suffocating, as though there was an invisible smoke making it impossible to breathe. I could not move, let alone scream. All I could do was stare at him, paralyzed. Then finally, when I thought I could not bear it anymore, I let out a scream and ran back into the house, not daring to look back. My legs trembled so much, they felt ready to give out at any moment, but my only concern was finding my daughter. When I reached her, she was still standing in the kitchen doorway, the same terrified expression on her face. I hugged her with all my strength, as if that gesture alone could protect us from whatever was happening. My heart pounded, my mind unable to organize my thoughts. I began to pray, my words stumbling out, almost inaudible, but I did not stop. I closed my eyes and repeated one after the other the prayers I had memorized since childhood. A chill coursed through my body, a tingling that suggested something beyond my understanding was present. No matter how hard I tried to focus on something else, the image of that man remained vivid in my mind. His face, those unyielding eyes, seemed etched into my memory like a mark impossible to erase. That same night, I took certain measures I had learned from my mother. I scattered salt around the yard, sprinkled holy water on the beds, and recited the Our Father several times, commanding that spirit to leave my home. I knew he was not a good soul. It was clear from the heaviness of his presence, the way his stare weighed down the environment. Fortunately, I never saw him again, but that experience marked the beginning of something greater, the attempts at communication from other dead who, in some way, sought something through me. One afternoon, as I was tending to household chores, a neighbor came by. She told me that a family in the neighboring community, up in the mountains, needed someone to lead the rosary at the wake of their matriarch. I accepted the invitation. A few hours later, a simple pickup truck, usually used for hauling cattle, arrived to pick me up. The smell of grass and damp wood was familiar and brought me some peace. We traveled along narrow paths until we reached a modest adobe house with a tile roof, hidden among the hills. Despite its simplicity, I noticed the care with which they had prepared the place. Candles placed around the coffin, fresh flowers on an improvised table, and the few family members seated in silence, bearing the weight of grief on their faces. The wake was quiet. Few people came, likely due to the distance and the dangers of traveling those roads at night. At the end, they offered me a cup of hot coffee, which I accepted gratefully. On the way back, it was the deceased woman's son who drove me back to the village. During the trip, he began talking about his mother, almost as though he could no longer hold back the memories. His voice trembled with emotion, filling the night's silence with stories of love and longing. As I listened, my heart grew heavy. We're never ready to lose our mothers, I thought. It does not matter how old we are or how many times we are told this moment will come. It is a pain that never truly heals. His words awakened an old sadness in me, the absence of my own mother. I remembered her delicate hands teaching me to pray, her gentle voice and certain guidance whenever I needed comfort. I remembered her eyes, always filled with patience and love, and how her passing left an emptiness time could not fully fill. Tears welled up, unstoppable. The love for our mothers is something so profound that even when we feel broken, it remains intact. When we arrived at my house, the young man parked the truck and opened the door for me. Before leaving, he thanked me not only for praying for his mother's rest, but also for listening to him. I watched him drive away, the sound of the engine fading into the night's darkness. I stood there, letting my emotions flow before entering my home. That night, I slept deeply. I dreamed I was standing on the bank of a crystal clear river, its waters so pure I could see every stone at the bottom. Everything around me was utterly still, as if the world was holding its breath. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the opposite bank. I recognized her at once. She was the mother of that young man. She wore a simple white dress, beautiful in its simplicity, and her face bore an expression difficult to decipher, a mix of confusion and sadness that moved me profoundly. For a few seconds, she just looked at me, as if she did not understand why she was there or how she had arrived. With a delicate voice, yet filled with pain, she began to speak. She said she was not ready to leave, that her heart had failed before its time, preventing her from fulfilling one of her greatest dreams, meeting her grandchild. She said that every day she prayed to God for the strength to wait for his arrival, just to hold him in her arms, even if only once. She revealed that she had pictured his little face 1,000 times, the sound of his cry, and how she would rock him until he fell asleep. Though life had given her a lot, it did not allow her to realize that final wish. As she spoke, her voice broke, and silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Still, she deeply thanked God for the family she had, for the children she loved so much, for the life she had lived, despite its imperfections. Yet the desire to meet her grandchild remained an unextinguished longing in her heart. As I listened, it felt like her sadness seeped into me, as if the weight of her pain made it hard to breathe. Without thinking, I approached and hugged her tightly. It was an instinctive gesture, an attempt to relieve her suffering. As I did so, I felt something strange, as though her anguish, her longing, and her yearning were transferred into me. Her crying intensified, and I felt her body trembling in my arms. I did not know what to say, because there are no words that can console someone who has lost so much. All I could do was hold her close and pray silently, asking that she find the peace she sought so desperately. The silence around us continued undisturbed. Then, slowly, everything started to fade. The crystalline glow of the water, her grief-stricken face, the cold tears on my shoulder. When I woke up, my eyes were wet, and my chest bore an inexplicable heaviness. I sat on the bed for a few minutes, trying to understand what had happened. Her words would not leave my mind. That sincere, profound wish to meet her grandchild. It was as if her pain had taken root in me, leaving a strange blend of sorrow and serenity. A few weeks later, I felt a sudden urge to return to that woman's house. I did not know exactly why, but something told me there was something pending with that family. One morning, while preparing mango preserves, I decided to bring them a small bag as a gift, a simple gesture that might offer comfort amid the memories of someone who was no longer there. I asked my husband to take me, and he agreed without hesitation. When we arrived, the deceased woman's son greeted me. The grief was still there in his expression, but there was something different in his eyes, an exhaustion mixed with hope. Inside the house, the atmosphere seemed changed. Although a trace of sadness remained, it was evident something new and full of life had arrived. Then I saw him, in a simple crib, wrapped in a modest blanket. Was the baby, the deceased woman's grandson, the one she had so desired to meet. For a moment, I felt my heart stop. The dream rushed back to me, with her voice breaking as she confessed her wish to hold him in her arms. The father invited me to pick him up, and though my hands shook, I did so. I lifted him gently, holding him close to my chest. He looked at me with those curious eyes, tiny but full of depth. Holding that baby, I felt something profound inside me snap. It was a bittersweet pain, an indescribable mix of sorrow and love. As I cradled him, I remembered the grandmother's words, her gratitude, her pain, and the wish she could not fulfill. I silently prayed, asking God to let her feel close to him somehow, that her love might surround him wherever she was now. Over the years, I learned to be more careful with the wakes I accepted. Some stories carried a weight that tested both my faith and my strength. Adriel was one of those cases. He was well known in the village, but not just for the good heart he once had, rather for the drastic change that marked his final years. For a long time, Adriel worked alongside my husband in the mango and plum orchards. He was a man of kind words and easy smiles, someone who seemed to brighten every conversation. Then, out of nowhere, he abandoned the orchards. He left his tools behind and started wearing expensive watches and clothes that did not match his past. He began talking about partners nobody knew, and inexplicably, his wealth grew rapidly. In the market, at neighbors' gatherings, and on the benches by the square, rumors spread. Some said he had gone into business with powerful people. Others claimed His earnings had a dubious origin, but what truly fueled the gossip was the thick gold chain he wore around his neck. The pendant it bore showed a strange figure, impossible to identify. One night at a gathering of friends, someone asked about that chain. Adriel, with a smile that was both mysterious and amused, only said, "It's my guardian." He gave no further details, but it was obvious that the object had nothing to do with traditional religious symbols. From that moment on, people eyed him with suspicion. He remained polite and kind, but there was something in his presence that caused discomfort. Many began to believe he had made a pact, and that chain was some sort of proof of his alliance. When news of his death reached the village, no one seemed very surprised, but a sense of unease settled in. Adriel had departed in his sleep, without warning or illness. For some, his death was punishment, the price of that supposed agreement. Others preferred silence, perhaps out of respect for the man he had been before he changed. When his family came to me, asking me to lead the rosary at his wake, my first instinct was to accept, as I always did. But something about Adriel's story made me hesitate. I thought about the memories my husband had shared of when they worked together, and about the profound transformation that consumed him in his final years. The wake was unlike any other. Despite the rumors and the weight of suspicion, many people attended. The villagers, still holding some affection for Adriel, seemed to have come more to support his family than to honor his memory. Families gathered, but hushed whispers filled the air, mingling with the prayers, creating a heavy, unsettling atmosphere. As I led the rosary, my husband remained outside with the other men, conversing quietly. Time seemed to drag on that night, as though Adriel's story hung over everyone, making the hours longer and the environment denser. The night passed calmly, without causing me discomfort or any strange feeling. In the days that followed, nothing out of the ordinary happened. I thought the tales of Adriel were mere rumors. Then came that afternoon, which would completely change my outlook. The sun was still shining, though its intensity had lessened, and the trees' shadows stretched across the surrounding fields. As I walked slowly with a shawl over my head to protect from the heat, I carried my basket of preserves as I did every week, following the same paths over and over. The road ahead was long and empty until something made me stop. On one side, behind the barbed wire fence bordering a property, I saw something on the ground. It looked like a man from a distance. He was lying on his back. I approached cautiously, thinking it might be a local farmhand, maybe even someone I knew. I called out to him, hoping for a response, but heard nothing. The body remained motionless, as if he had not heard me. I hesitated, glanced around for anyone who could help, but there was no one, no living soul in sight. I took a deep breath, set my basket down, and reached out, apprehensive about what I might find. I noticed the body was strangely stiff, more so than usual. I thought of going to a nearby house for help. As I turned to grab my basket, I felt a yank on my shawl. The pull was so sudden and strong that I nearly lost my balance. When I turned to see what was holding me, my heart nearly stopped. On the other side of the barbed wire fence stood an indescribable figure, barely recognizable as human. Its body was grotesque, with scorched skin covered in crusts that ranged from a searing red to a deep black. Under the waning afternoon light, its appearance radiated something horrendous, as if it was both alive and disintegrating at the same time. I tried to scream, but the sound barely left my throat. That thing gripped me firmly, pulling with terrifying strength while I fought to free myself. The barbed wire tore my skin, but I could not let it drag me away. It seemed human, yet horribly distorted. Its movements were clumsy but charged with desperate intensity. It yanked me frantically, as if its very existence depended on taking me with it. My legs shook, but instinct kept me anchored. I clung to the wire, ignoring the pain as the barbs dug into my flesh. I felt my body giving way, but with a final effort, I managed to wrench free. My sandals slipped on the loose earth as I started running without looking back. My feet could hardly keep pace, and I nearly fell multiple times, but fear propelled me forward. The path seemed endless, blurred by the tears streaming down my face. I wept, my chest burning, unable to think of anything but fleeing as fast as possible. I did not stop running until the houses of the village came into view. When I arrived, my legs buckled, and I collapsed to the ground, trembling uncontrollably and mentally shattered by a terror I still could not comprehend. At home, it was my husband who saw me first. Seeing the cuts on my arms and the blood on my clothes, his face turned pale. He looked both terrified and furious, demanding to know who had hurt me. I tried to explain, my voice quivering and my body weak, that this had not been the work of a person. I described the skin mottled red and black, the empty marble eyes, and the strength with which that thing had grabbed me from behind the barbed wire. But the more I spoke, the more disbelief I saw in his eyes and in the eyes of the neighbors who gathered to hear my story. It was as if my words made no sense, an impossibility in their logic. They looked at me with pity and doubt, as though trying to decide whether I was telling the truth or had lost my mind. The next morning, when I tried to get up, my body refused to obey. I felt trapped between waking and sleeping, unable to move my arms or legs. It was like invisible hands held my wrists and ankles against the bed. The pressure was immense, nearly unreal, while a suffocating heat filled my chest as if I were burning from within. Then I heard a scream. It was my youngest daughter, crying in a way that tore at my soul. I knew something terrible was happening to her, but I could not open my eyes, shout, or move. Tears slipped down my face as helplessness consumed me. Despair built inside me like a raw force, an uncontrollable urge to break free somehow. Then, all at once, I woke up. I jumped out of bed and ran outside. In the yard, I found my husband and children all staring at me in confusion. My daughter stood there, perfectly fine, with no sign of pain or distress. I stopped, bewildered. The looks they gave me said more than words. They thought I had gone crazy. While they tried to calm me, all I felt was a growing emptiness in my chest. My body began to betray me slowly. Each day, I felt weaker, as if an invisible force was draining my energy. Eating, which once gave me pleasure, turned into a burden. Every bite felt like a stone, hard to swallow, leaving a painful heaviness in my stomach. Sometimes the discomfort lasted for hours. Other times, I would simply give up on eating. My body wasted away. Fatigue became a constant shadow, and even simple tasks became nearly impossible. My hands trembled when I tried to hold anything, but what frightened me most was not my physical frailty. It was what happened when I closed my eyes. Nights, which once provided comfort, became a torment. Whenever I slept, I was dragged into dark, unknown places. Adriel, the man whose wake I had prayed at, appeared in all my dreams. His face was unrecognizable, distorted by pain, and his body moved in ways that defied human logic. He screamed, but no words came out. It was a deep lament, a sound that seemed to come from within me, freezing every part of my being. His suffering was so evident, I wanted to look away, but I could not. He was there, twisting on the ground, trapped in a pain that seemed endless, as if his own body was a cell of agony. Sometimes I could make out two words in his screams: forgiveness and help. Even after I awoke, they echoed in my mind, tormenting me. I could not understand what he wanted from me. What terrified me most, however, was the sense that he was not alone. In certain dreams, I walked along a path lined with towering trees. I sensed something was following me. I felt the cold air on my back, like a warning. When I turned around, there was the creature, the same one that had attacked me before. It came at me with clumsy but unnervingly quick motions. Its skin, red and black, glistened beneath the sun, filtering through the leaves. I tried to run, but my feet sank into the earth, as if the ground itself wanted to trap me. Between the trunks, I witnessed a horrifying scene. The creature was dragging Adriel by his feet with unspeakable brutality. His back scraped against the ground, leaving a trail of blood and mud. Adriel screamed, a piercing sound that froze me inside. I wanted to help him, but my body would not move. I could only watch as he was taken into the darkness. I woke up crying, breath ragged and heart racing. I begged Adriel to leave me alone. I could not understand why he kept appearing in my dreams, or why his pain seemed tied to me. In my worst moments of despair, I prayed, asking God to free me from the oppressive shadow closing in on me. Even awake, I never shook the feeling that something was circling around me. My husband and children noticed my exhaustion, but they could not comprehend what I was facing. Each time I tried to explain, their doubting looks made me give up. Loneliness became my only companion, and fear enveloped me in a cycle that felt endless. Nighttime at home was my fragile refuge, held up only by faith. Before sleeping, I knelt before a small altar I had assembled over the years. At its center was an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, surrounded by a small crucifix and an old photograph of my mother. The picture, its edges worn by time, was my anchor. As I prayed, my eyes remained fixed on it, seeking strength in the memory of the resilient woman I had always admired. My prayers were long and fervent. I pleaded for protection, begging God to drive away whatever tormented me. Each word was weighted with fear, but also a desperate hope. I prayed for my family's safety, asking that whatever shadows hovered near my home never reached them. Many times, I was overcome by sobs. Tears flowed uncontrollably while I tried to keep my voice steady. The heaviness in my chest felt unendurable. On some nights, I stayed there for hours, as though that sacred space was the only place safe from what pursued me. Everything changed on an ordinary afternoon. I had just finished cooking lunch and was washing dishes, lost in thought. when I felt an inexplicable urge to go to my room. It was a need bigger than me, as if something was calling. With hesitant steps, I walked down the hallway, trying to ignore the cold that had suddenly invaded the house. When I entered my bedroom, I stopped abruptly at the sight of the altar. Someone was kneeling there. My heart began pounding wildly, fast and hard, as though it would jump out of my chest. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her body was twisted abnormally, as if it were painful just to remain in that position. The shawl draped over her shoulders was worn and filthy, while her presence exuded a suffocating intensity impossible to describe. For a moment, I stood still, eyes fixed on the figure before me, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then the truth struck me. That was not human. It was the same entity that had been tormenting me, the creature that dragged Adriel in my nightmares, the shadow that had infiltrated my life. I could not make a sound. My breath quickened, but I forced myself to remain in control. After everything I had been through, I had learned a harsh lesson. Never show fear in the face of the inexplicable. I began backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure. Each step was shaky, but silent. When I reached the doorway, I left the house without haste, doing my best to appear calm. Outside, the fresh air cooled my face, offering fleeting relief. I paused in the yard, took a deep breath, and fought against the tremor coursing through my hands. My body felt close to collapse, but I could not let panic consume me. I closed my eyes and repeated to myself that everything would be all right, that I would not let tears fall again. My faith, shaken and fragile, was the only support I had left. I clung to it, recalling the prayers my mother had taught me, her words about divine strength and the certainty that evil never prevails when you stand with God. That night, I returned to the altar. I found only melted candles and a lingering unease, as if that sacred place had been violated. Even so, I knelt with the same devotion as always. I closed my eyes and whispered pleas for protection, knowing the battle was not yet over. Despite everything, I did not feel completely alone. The next morning, I awoke with my body weighed down, as though fatigue had seeped into my bones. I went to the kitchen and drank some holy water, a habit I had adopted, believing each sip would strengthen me against whatever lurked around me. I took the medicine the doctor had prescribed, though the words of neighbors and friends about seeking out healers echoed in my mind. Many offered that advice with good intentions, but I felt my path was to remain in the faith that had accompanied me since childhood. That trust in God was my mantra, something I repeated constantly to convince myself I would not be abandoned, even in the darkest moments. Still, my body did not seem to share that certainty. Each day, my weakness grew. My legs would give out when I walked, and my hands shook when I tried to hold things. My husband was increasingly worried. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the slight tremor in his voice when he tried to console me. He was never one to show much affection, but now he hugged me often, holding me so tightly it felt as if he feared I would vanish. I sensed his fear in the grip of his hands and heard his muffled sobs at night when he thought I was asleep. One especially difficult afternoon, when the despair felt unbearable, I sat before the altar. The familiar images were there, serene as always, but now their silence was not enough to soothe me. I closed my eyes and let the words flow. They were not traditional prayers or memorized lines. They were desperate pleas, rising from the depths of a soul that saw no other way out. I thank God for the life He had granted me, for the gift of raising my children, for each moment by their side. I confessed my acceptance of His will, acknowledging that He had a purpose, but I begged for more time. I did not want to leave them. I could not imagine being gone, missing the days I would watch them grow, not being there to protect them. Every word I spoke seemed to draw out the last bits of energy I had, as if my soul was pouring itself into that prayer. Then I felt it. A warm hand took hold of mine. It was such a gentle yet firm touch, there was no mistaking it. My heart recognized it immediately. It was my mother's hand. I kept my eyes closed, unable to break that moment. The way she squeezed my hand said more than any words could. It was as though she was conveying the strength she had given me so many times during my childhood, reassuring me that everything would be okay. Suddenly, a rush of memories flooded my mind, as if a door someone had locked years ago was flung open. I saw her face lit by the yellow glow of the kitchen as she prepared dinner. I remembered her delicate hands brushing my hair before bedtime, and the sound of her laughter filling the afternoons, making life infinitely lighter. Her presence turned hard days into something bearable, and her words had the power to calm any storm. These memories washed over me in waves, filling every corner of my heart. Her love seemed to envelop me, an unbreakable connection no amount of time could sever. She still held my hand, sending the silent message that I was not alone, that I had strength within me to carry on. Tears began to stream down my face, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. They carried relief and hope. For the first time in ages, I felt I could breathe. Right then and there, I made a promise. I swore to my mother, to God, and to myself that I would not give up. I would fight with everything I had for my children, for my family, for the life I cherished so dearly. I sobbed like a child, pouring out all the pain I had been holding in. The days that followed that encounter at the altar brought a sense of rebirth. Gradually, I noticed the suffocating weight lifting. That constant feeling of being watched faded. It was as if the very atmosphere of the house had changed, becoming lighter. At last, I could breathe. The nightmares that once dominated my nights began to fade. I no longer saw Adriel or the creature that pursued me. In their place, the silence transformed into a peace I thought I would never feel again. My body also began to recover. Food, which had felt like a burden, became nourishing again, even pleasurable. My hands grew steadier. My legs regained strength, and the vitality I feared I had lost came back. The light in our home shone once more. My children laughed again, and my husband, though still reserved, showed in his gestures that he, too, felt the change. A few weeks later, with my strength almost fully restored, I resumed my prayers, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. I sensed God had been with me all along, guiding me even when I could not perceive it. Now, I understood that all the trials I had faced were a test, a path to fortify my faith and spirit. Each time I knelt before the altar, I felt a calm beyond words. My prayers became honest conversations filled with love and surrender. I gave thanks for the life I had built, for each moment with my children, and for the courage to face the shadows that once surrounded me. Deep in my soul, I felt I was exactly where I should be, walking the path God had set for me. Love found its way into our home again. My husband and I reconnected in a way that had not happened in a long time. He began to embrace me more, with a tenderness that warmed my heart. Today, looking back, I see each moment, good times, hardships, nights of fear, and the tears shed. Each one is part of the story that brought me here. I harbor no resentment or bitterness, only gratitude for overcoming what once seemed insurmountable. I live each day with serenity, aware that I am never alone. My trust in God's plan is complete. In His love and in the guidance He gives, I find the foundation to keep moving forward. I know that when my time in this world ends, I will be beside my husband again in heaven. And there, we will find the eternal peace we have always sought. Until that day comes, I live each day as a gift, a chance to love more, to thank more, and to go forward with renewed faith. Even if shadows of the past still exist in some form, I know they no longer hold power over me. My faith has grown stronger than any darkness, and that is the testimony I carry. Even the hardest challenges can be overcome when there is courage in the heart and trust in God's path. When I began my journey as a paramedic, I had an experience that made me reconsider whether that was the right path for me. It was on a silent night when we received an urgent call. An elderly man was suffering a heart attack. As soon as we arrived, we found the man lying on the floor, clutching his chest with both hands. We asked the family members to leave the room and began providing care. His skin had a bluish tint. He was struggling to breathe, and he complained of intense chest pain. At times, he would lose consciousness and then come to again. There was a moment when he grabbed my arm tightly, begging for help. We managed to stabilize him temporarily, but suddenly his gaze shifted to something behind us, in the corner of the room. His eyes widened, filled with pure terror. He grew even paler and began moving backward, as if trying to escape from something invisible. We kept telling him to stay calm so we could continue helping him, but he seemed incapable of hearing us. His expression stayed with me, a look of absolute panic, as he desperately repeated, "No, no, no, not that. Please, no." That was when I felt his body lose all tension, as if life had simply drained out of him. We tried to revive him, but he passed away right there, his face still frozen in fear. To this day, whenever I remember that scene, a chill runs down my spine. To this day, I prefer not to think about what he might have seen in his final moments in that corner of the room. Good evening, Dom. I truly admire your stories. They always keep me company while I work. My name is Diego Martins, and what I'm about to share happened in Guadalupe, Nuevo León. It's quite a long story that spans my childhood and part of my teenage years. From a young age, my mother was quite strict with us. I understand that she had a difficult life, so I don't blame her. I remember she insisted I sleep alone in my room, saying that because I was a boy. I needed to learn to be brave. I was only 7 years old, and I never had the courage to admit it. But fear consumed me every night. As soon as I lay down, it felt like something was scratching under my bed. The noise seemed to come from there and happened almost every night. I never had the courage to peek and see what it was, and my parents didn't believe me. They kept sending me to sleep in the same place, as if it were all in my head. Over time, things started to get stranger. My parents began to notice unusual happenings. They said I would get up in the middle of the night, always around 3 o'clock, and go downstairs. I would sit as if talking to someone. My father would come after me and take me back to my room. But while all of this happened, I remained fast asleep. Only then did they start to suspect that something really wasn't right. Even so, life in the house continued more or less the same. Then it happened. It was on a cold January night. My parents decided we would all sleep together in the same bed. I thought I'd feel safer pressed against the wall. The hours passed, but I couldn't fall asleep. I covered myself up to my nose, as I always did, leaving just a small gap to breathe. That's when I felt something strange, strands of hair brushing against my face. Once, then again. I figured it was my sister's hair and didn't pay attention. But unfortunately, I ended up opening my eyes. That was when I saw her. A woman was stuck to the wall, as if she were upside down. Her hair hung down toward me. I still remember every detail. Her hands, dark and worn with dirty nails. I couldn't clearly make out her face, but there she was, swaying gently from side to side. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. With some effort, I mustered a bit of courage. I curled up under the blanket and hugged my sister. Only a thin layer of fabric separated us from that presence. Still, I could hear her breathing. It was quick, labored, almost like panting, right next to me. Then the sound of my father getting up to go to the bathroom seemed to frighten her. She vanished. Eventually, I managed to get some sleep, even if only for a short while. Dawn brought a bit of relief, knowing my father would be up early for work, and seeing the first rays of sunlight gave me some reassurance. That house had always felt strange from the moment we moved in. Even the way my parents got the place was odd. They say that wasn't the house they had chosen. The construction company explained that the house reserved for them had been taken by other clients. As an alternative, they offered the last house on the property, which no one else had wanted. It was isolated, near a ravine and an empty lot. There were nights when I dreamed of a little girl without a mouth, as if it had been burned. Her hair was short, and her deep brown eyes seemed to hide secrets. In my dreams, she tried to communicate, but all that came out was a humming or an incomprehensible murmur. My brother also had unsettling experiences in that house. He remembers one specific night, November 12th, that left a deep impression on him. While sleeping, he was awakened by a strange sound. Our bedroom had a carpet, and there was a toy dinosaur that made noise when it detected movement. That night, he heard something dragging across the carpet. He lay still with fear, but the bigger scare came when the dinosaur activated on its own, as if someone were standing right in front of it. Determined to put an end to it, he got up to remove the batteries from the dinosaur. But when he checked, the toy had no batteries. Terrified, He ran to wake me up, and together we fled to our parents' room. Another night, we were alone at home. It was late. I was in the living room, and my brother was in the kitchen. This time, what happened left a permanent mark on us because we both witnessed it. First, we heard hurried footsteps coming down the stairs. Then, those same footsteps raced back up. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I rushed to hug my brother, who also seemed frozen with fear. Right after that, we heard something else, a child's laugh, clearly coming from the second floor. It sounded like a little girl jumping around, playing. The terror was indescribable. We clung to each other and began to slowly walk toward the front door, not daring to let go. Every step felt like it took an eternity. Finally, we reached the door, went out, and stood there looking up at the bedroom window where the noises had come from. When my parents arrived, they were shocked to see us outside the house at 2 a.m. They asked what had happened, but I preferred not to say anything. I knew they wouldn't believe me. My brother, however, spoke up. That night was a turning point for them. They realized that what we were experiencing wasn't just our imagination. They decided it was time to move. We moved to a house in Santa Monica, Juarez, Nuevo Leon, but the move didn't bring relief. On the contrary, things got worse. One night, coming back late from my grandmother's house, around 2 a.m, something happened. As soon as we came in, my father hurried to the bathroom, and I went to clean my shoes because I had stepped in dog poop. In my room, there was a window that opened onto a balcony with a small gate around it. As I passed by the window, I noticed a slight gap in the curtain, and without knowing why, I felt drawn to look out. That's when I saw her. On the other side of the gate, standing on the balcony, was a girl. I can't say for sure if it was the same girl from my dreams, but something inside me told me it was. Her hair was now long and dark, and the dim streetlight barely revealed her figure. I couldn't distinguish her eyes or her hands. She was just a still shadow, silently watching me. In that moment, the only thought that crossed my mind was that maybe she was a neighbor or a friend of my sister's. But then I noticed something terrifying. The girl had no feet. She was floating. I felt my body freeze, as if time had stopped, even though it all happened in just a few seconds. The sound of my father coming out of the bathroom snapped me out of my trance, and the girl disappeared at that exact moment. She didn't run or vanish suddenly. It was more like she dissolved into the ground, as if she were part of it. I ran to my father and told him I'd seen a girl outside. He went out with me, flashlight in hand. But as expected, there was no one there. Things kept happening, each time more disturbing. One night, while my parents were arguing with me and my sister, my older brother came out of his room with a confused look on his face. He said he had seen someone peeking through the backyard window. We all went to check, but we found nothing. I think it was the first time my parents really started to believe something odd was going on. That night, my brother looked at me and said, "Now, I really believe you." Time went by, and we moved houses several more times, but it seemed like these occurrences followed us. It was as if we were carrying a shadow. Even so, I never stopped dreaming about the girl without a mouth. But what happened when I was 18 was undoubtedly the most significant event. At the time, my girlfriend, who is now my wife, was pregnant. From the start, I had a deep feeling it would be a girl, even though everyone around me was convinced it would be a boy. The last time I saw the girl from my dreams was one night when I was sleeping alone. I was lying on my side, and when I opened my eyes, there she was again. This time, I could see her more clearly. Her mouth looked scarred by burns, dried out and without shape, as if it had been consumed by fire. Her eyes stared at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce my soul. She moved slowly from side to side, humming the same melody I always heard in my dreams. I felt a fear that froze my entire body. I closed my eyes, trying to make her go away, but the sound of that lullaby seemed to get even closer, as if it were right in my ear. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, I heard the sound grow distant, as if she were moving toward the wardrobe. Then silence fell. She was gone. That was the last time I had any contact with her. Shortly after, my daughter was born, and though I don't know if it was just a coincidence or something else, there's a part of me that believes that little girl and my daughter are connected somehow, in ways I can't explain. In the heart of my university campus, there is a large and tranquil lake. The buildings spread out around it. On one side are the classrooms, and on the other, the student dormitories. Right in the center of the lake, there is a small island about 20 meters long, where a gazebo stands. 2 bridges connect the island to the rest of the campus, one leading to the dormitories and the other to the university buildings. When classes end, there are always 2 options to get back. Take the long way around the lake or cross one of the bridges. One evening, after a class that ran late, I decided to take the shorter route. I was walking along the first bridge, heading toward my dorm, when I noticed someone on the other bridge. The figure was wearing a white hoodie with the hood covering their head and was walking in my direction. As I reached the end of the bridge, I lost sight of the person. I found it strange, but didn't think much of it. I kept walking and entered the island, making my way toward the second bridge. That was when I realized something unsettling. We should have crossed paths, but the person had simply vanished. There was nowhere for them to have hidden. Without a second thought, I started running toward my dorm. When I arrived, still trying to catch my breath, I found my roommate, who also looked visibly shaken. I told him what had just happened, but he interrupted me. Was it someone in a white hoodie? At that moment, I found out that he had experienced the same thing the previous semester. Since then, I never dared to cross that bridge at night again. No one spoke about it openly, but it was clear that this was the reason everyone preferred the longer route, after dark.